the next page, I talk about the front page of the New York Times 1923, and I reference some information there. And I just happen to have a reprint of the front page of the New York Times from 1923. And there's an article here about the German hyperinflation. But what I find more interesting than that is the entire paper is this wonderful time capsule. And if you replaced the names and dates and names of countries and so on in most of these articles, so far started to spend their currency as soon as they got it. The currency had become a hot potato, and no one wanted to hang on to it for a second. Now, on the next page, I talk about the front page of the New York Times 1923, and I reference some information there. And I just happen to have a reprint of the front page of the New York Times from 1923. And there's an article here about the German hyperinflation. But what I find more interesting than that is the entire paper is this wonderful time capsule. And if you replaced the names and dates and names of countries and so on in most of these articles, it would all be pertinent today. You'd think that you were reading today's newspaper. But when it comes to this article on the German hyperinflation, it talks about these paper mills pumping out 45 billion marks per day. Now, this is the February edition of the New York Times. By November, those paper mills were pumping out 500 quadrillion marks per day. So now we're going to take a look at velocity and how it could affect us in the future. So this is me. Now, I developed this keynote presentation to make understanding velocity easy. Most economists make it sound really complex and people don't think they can understand it. But stick with me, I think you'll enjoy this. When you're measuring velocity, you're measuring the number of times each unit of currency changes hands. I'm going to have lunch, and I'm going to pay the waiter. I'm going to tip him $1. And then he parked in a red zone that morning, so his car got towed. He's going to have to take a cab home, and he's going to pay that cab driver that same dollar when he gets to his destination. Then later on that day, the cab driver is going to have to fill his cab with gas, and he's going to use that same dollar again as part of the payment to pay for his tank of gas. So that dollar was used in 1, 2, 3 transactions. It had a velocity of 3 that day. In other words, $1 bought $3 worth of goods and services. Now we're going to kick this up a notch, and we're going to call this a country of 10 people, this economy of just 10 people, and their currency supply is $1. That's the only dollar that exists. And it circulates once, and so you've got $1 times a velocity of 1 equals a GDP, the size of the economy, is $1. If it circulates twice, it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So $1 times a velocity of 10, or 10 transactions, equals a $10 GDP, the health of that economy. Now, if you expand the currency supply, we've given each one of these people $1. If they all make a transaction, there has now been 10 transactions, but each dollar was only involved in one of them. So it's a currency supply of $10 times 1 transaction each equals a $10 GDP. So even though you've got 10 times the currency supply, the economy has the same vibrance. There was 10 transactions, it equals $10. Then we have a second transaction, a third, a fourth. This could be a healthy economy. It could also be an economy running into hyperinflation. Keynesians, that's the type of economists that are running the modern day economy, believe that you can create a healthy economy by changing this figure here, the size of the currency supply. So the Federal Reserve thinks that by adding currency to the economy that they're going to be able to stimulate it and make the economy grow. And the thing is, it isn't the quantity of currency, it's the amount of goods and services that are created in that country that determines the country's level of prosperity. So if you just add a bunch of currency, all it's going to do eventually is drive up prices. Velocity will slow at first, and that's what we're seeing now. Well, the same thing happened in Weimar Germany. This is the entire hyperinflation from the beginning of World War I in 1914 until the end of 1923. And most economists are attracted to this big hyperinflation on the end. But one thing I discovered when I was writing my book is that there's almost always a pre-hyperinflation hyperinflation, and we see one here, where there's this rise of prices and quantity of currency, and then it levels off for a little while, and then rises again. And this has to do with the psychology. This is the time where I said those people had been there before and experienced that. I'm going to zoom up on it. And so here you see the currency supply increasing. So they're doing monetary inflation, but prices stay level, and the price of gold actually dropped toward the end of the war. But as soon as the anxiety is lifted from the population and they start feeling better, all of that currency comes out of hiding and people start making transactions, and velocity picks up, and prices, and the price of gold especially, just rose dramatically and then leveled off some 16 times higher than they were originally. Notice that the currency supply is growing at a certain rate. The prices are delayed, and then bam, they rise to meet it and exceed it, and then stabilize to account for that quantity of currency. Now back to this original chart here, what I find interesting is that during the war it lagged, and then it caught up and matched the currency supply. But then as they kept on printing, velocity started to exceed the currency supply. So prices started to rise faster than they were printing currency, and that's the end game for a hyperinflation. The big lesson here is that the people who owned gold and silver instead of the national currency came out relatively unscathed, or even made huge gains in their purchasing power. Now, this is the U.S. currency supply from 1918 until today. And we've created all of this currency, but we haven't seen any ravaging inflation yet. And that is because velocity has fallen to compensate for the creation of currency. But there will come a time when the psychology of the country changes, and you will see, after this short-term deflation, where velocity falls even further, you will then see the velocity pick up and prices will rise. And I believe that we will go into a hyperinflation because they're going to create more currency than this. And that currency is going to be sitting there, and velocity will have slowed and slowed and slowed to compensate it until something changes psychologically. The beginning of every hyperinflation looks like everything is okay again. The economy gets better, velocity picks up, and that's the really danger point, and nobody can see it as velocity starts picking up.
Right, well, of course, there's a name for that. It's called money illusion, which is before the inflation really kicks in and either gets extreme or turns into hyperinflation. There is this feel-good period where